The forest was quiet that morning, just the hum of cicadas, the smell of fresh pine, and the crunch of tires over dirt. A single truck rolled up a narrow gravel road, carrying a small wooden cabin on its trailer. The driver, Ethan Cole, had waited months for this moment. His dream was simple: to live off-grid in peace, surrounded by trees instead of neighbors. But as he turned the last corner toward his property, he froze. Parked right at his new driveway, 3 patrol cars, lights flashing, radios crackling, and behind them, a cluster of people in neat clothes clutching clipboards and phones. They weren't strangers. They were his new neighbors from the nearby gated community, the HOA that claimed to manage this forest stretch. Ethan slowed his truck, confusion painted all over his face. The cabin on his trailer swayed slightly as he braked. One of the officers stepped forward, hand raised. "Sir, we've had reports of unauthorized construction in a restricted area," he said flatly. Ethan blinked. "Construction? I'm just moving in. I bought this land, legally." But before he could say more, one woman stepped out from behind the officers. Blonde hair, expensive sunglasses, lips curled into a smug smile. "We told you this area's under HOA jurisdiction," she snapped. "You can't just drag a cabin in here and set up like some wild camper." He looked at her, then at the officers, then back at his cabin. "So you called the police? Because I'm moving into my own land?" The woman crossed her arms. "You'll need to take that thing back where it came from. We have community standards." And that's when something strange happened. One of the officers turned toward her and smiled. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "maybe you should step aside. You might not realize who you're talking to." Her smirk faltered. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. What was happening? Why were the cops smiling at him? And then, as the officer leaned toward Ethan's truck window, he said something quietly, something that made the HOA crowd's confidence vanish in seconds. Whatever it was, their faces changed. Their hands dropped from their hips. One of them even muttered, "Oh no," under her breath. But what did the police know that the HOA didn't? And why did the man they tried to stop suddenly seem untouchable? The truth, and what those neighbors didn't realize about Ethan, would soon turn this quiet forest road into the most talked-about standoff the town had ever seen. The morning started calm, the kind that makes you forget the world's noise. Mist hung low between the pine trunks as Ethan's old pickup groaned its way up the forest road, towing behind it a small wooden cabin he'd built with his own hands. Not a prefab unit, not a store-bought kit. Every board, every nail was something he'd touched, sanded, painted himself. For him, this wasn't just a cabin. It was escape. He'd spent years in the city, crowded streets, office cubicles, landlords who raised rent every 6 months, and neighbors who called the cops over barking dogs. The forest, though, this was supposed to be different. He'd found the plot through a private cellar, right outside the HOA boundary line. It was quiet, secluded, and free, or at least that's what he'd thought. As he reached his new clearing, Ethan parked the truck and climbed out, boots crunching over damp soil. The air smelled like rain and cedar. A hawk screeched somewhere above. He stood there for a second, just breathing, the cabin behind him swaying gently on the trailer, sunlight cutting through the mist like a promise. He walked the perimeter, checking his markers, the ones he'd carefully placed after weeks of confirming boundaries and permits. Everything was in order. No rules broken, no trespassing. This was his. By mid-morning, he was unloading tools, setting up the foundation blocks, humming quietly to himself. For the first time in years, the noise he heard wasn't traffic or sirens. It was birds, wind and the rhythmic sound of his hammer. Then, just as he started securing the cabin's side supports, he noticed something odd through the trees, a shimmer of movement on the ridge. He squinted. A figure standing still, arms folded, watching. He waved, but the person didn't wave back. Instead, they turned, walked away, and disappeared into the brush. Ethan frowned. Probably just a hiker, he told himself, but a strange unease crept into his chest. A few hours later, while he was unloading more supplies, a silver SUV rolled slowly down the path, clean, shiny, out of place among the mud and leaves. It stopped near his truck. The window slid down. Inside was a woman in her 40s, perfectly dressed, with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hi there," she said sweetly. Are you aware this area is part of the Cedar Ridge community? Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead. I bought this plot from the county registry. It's not inside your HOA. I checked the maps. Her smile stayed frozen. Well, sometimes those maps can be misleading. We just like to make sure new residents know our rules. No mobile structures, no trailers, it's a cabin. Ethan cut in, calm but firm. Not a trailer. And it's staying. The woman's face tightened. We'll see about that. She drove off, her tires throwing dust over his freshly marked boundary. For the rest of the day, Ethan tried to shake it off. But by sunset, when he went to grab dinner from his cooler, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. One of his boundary flags, the bright orange marker, was gone. Just a clean stick snapped in half and tossed near the bushes. That night, as he sat by the small lantern light inside his unfinished cabin, the forest no longer felt as peaceful. Somewhere beyond the trees, he thought he saw headlights flicker once, then vanish. And though he told himself he wasn't afraid, he couldn't help but wonder. Was that woman coming back? And if she did, how far was she willing to go to make him leave? The morning air was crisp enough to see his breath. Ethan's old pickup creaked along the narrow dirt road, the small wooden cabin swaying behind it on a heavy trailer. The pines around him stood tall and silent, watching like sentinels as he finally reached the clearing he'd dreamed about for months. This was supposed to be the start of peace, a quiet life. Just him, the cabin he built with his own hands, and the endless whisper of the woods. He'd left behind the noise, the endless meetings, the people always telling him what he couldn't do. Out here there were no rules. No HOA, no city codes, no neighbors peering through curtains. Just space and the kind that made you feel human again. He parked the truck and stepped out, stretching as sunlight broke through the morning fog. The ground was soft with pine needles. The air smelled like rain and wood smoke from somewhere far away. For a moment, it all felt perfect, untouched, honest. He walked the land slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the soil. Every step he took matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He checked the wooden stakes and orange boundary flags he'd planted weeks ago. Each one perfectly aligned. Everything was right where it should be. The legal map, the paperwork, all clean. This land was his fair and square. By mid-morning, he was unloading tools. A hammer, a level, a box of nails that clinked softly in the breeze. He worked quietly, humming as he began setting the base of the cabin down on the flattened ground. The forest answered back with birdsong and the low groan of branches in the wind. For the first time in years, Ethan smiled without forcing it. But then something caught his attention. Movement at the edge of the tree line, a flash of color between the trunks. He turned, squinting. For a second, he thought he saw someone standing there, a silhouette, still watching. He raised a hand, waved once, nothing. The figure didn't move. Then just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He stood there a while, waiting to hear footsteps or leaves crunching. But the forest went silent again, as if holding its breath. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe just a deer. He told himself that and got back to work. By noon, he'd made real progress. The cabin was settled in its spot, tools stacked neatly on a tarp. He sat down on the trailer's edge, wiped sweat from his face, and stared at what he'd built. Felt right, real, until he heard tires. The low hum of an engine broke the calm. A silver SUV turned down his path. Too clean for this kind of road. It rolled to a stop near his truck. The window lowered and a woman's face appeared. Early 40s, polished, her expression the kind that mixed curiosity with judgment. "Good morning," she said, smiling too wide. "Are you new here?" Ethan nodded cautiously. "Just getting settled. Bought this plot a few months ago." Her smile thinned. "Oh, really? You do know this is part of the Cedar Ridge HOA, right?" He shook his head. "It's not. My deed says unregulated property outside your boundary." The woman's eyes flicked toward the cabin. That's funny. 'Cause we don't allow trailers, mobile homes, or temporary structures in our community." "It's not temporary," Ethan replied, steady but polite. "And it's not in your community." The woman's hand tightened on the wheel. Her tone softened, but her eyes didn't. "I'll make sure our office checks that. We like to keep things orderly around here." She drove off slowly, tires grinding against the dirt. Ethan watched until the SUV disappeared down the road. The birds had stopped singing again. The quiet felt heavier this time, like the forest itself was waiting to see what happened next. He got back to work, but his focus was gone. Every sound felt sharper. Every gust of wind through the branches sounded like someone whispering his name. Later, when he went to check his boundary flags again, he froze. One was missing. Another was snapped clean in half, lying in the mud like someone had stepped on it deliberately. He looked back toward the road. No movement. No tire tracks. Just silence. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet arrival wasn't going to stay quiet for long. The next morning came too early. The sun had barely crested over the trees when Ethan woke to the sound of crunching gravel outside his cabin. At first he thought it was an animal again, until he heard voices. Calm, clipped, professional. He stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, and froze. Two men in polo shirts stood beside a white pickup marked Cedar Ridge HOA Compliance Division. They were inspecting his trailer, one of them snapping photos while the other scribbled notes on a clipboard. "Morning," Ethan called, setting down his mug. "Can I help you with something?" The taller one turned, flashing a polite but sharp smile. "Sir, this structure isn't permitted on this property. You're in violation of Community Ordinance 14B. No temporary dwellings or mobile units allowed within Cedar Ridge limits." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're mistaken. My land's not part of your HOA. I bought it from a private seller, verified with the county." The man's smile didn't move. "Boundaries can be confusing out here, but we'll get it clarified. In the meantime, you'll need to suspend construction until this is resolved." He turned back to the cabin like the matter was settled. Ethan stepped closer, voice calm but firm. "You don't have authority here. Unless you've got a county order, you're trespassing." The man's partner shifted uneasily, glancing at him. "We're just following procedure, sir." "Yeah?" Ethan crossed his arms. "Then follow it somewhere else." They didn't argue. They simply packed up, got in the truck, and drove off. But not before one of them leaned out the window and said, "We'll be in touch." The rest of the day was tense. Ethan tried to ignore it, focusing on wiring the cabin and running power from the generator. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once he caught movement through the trees. Flashes of color, shadows that moved when the wind didn't. By afternoon, he decided to take a break and drove into town for supplies. When he returned a few hours later, something was wrong. The ground near his cabin was disturbed. His tools, carefully organized that morning, were scattered across the dirt. A few of the boundary flags had been pulled out entirely. And taped to the door was a letter, laminated in plastic like an official notice. "Notice of violation," it read in bold. "Cease all construction immediately pending HOA investigation. Non-compliance may result in fines and legal action." He laughed out loud, a short, bitter sound. Unbelievable. He grabbed his phone, ready to call the county office, but stopped when headlights flashed down the road. Another SUV, the same silver one from yesterday. The woman stepped out again, clipboard in hand, this time wearing a badge that read, "HOA Chairperson, Marlene Keene." "Mr. Cole," she said smoothly, "we issued you a formal notice. You're required to comply." "I'm not under your jurisdiction," he replied, stepping closer. "I checked with the county before I bought this land." Marlene's smile stayed fixed. "Boundaries shift. Sometimes surveys are incorrect. Till we verify, this area falls under our oversight." Ethan's patience snapped. "Then verify it. But until then, stay off my property." For the first time, her expression faltered, just slightly. She took a step back, eyes cold. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. We have ways of enforcing order here." Then she got back in her SUV and drove off. That night, the woods around the cabin felt different, restless. Ethan sat by his small fire, staring into the orange glow as something deep in his chest twisted uneasily. He could hear faint engines in the distance, the hum of vehicles far down the road, then silence, then a single click, like a camera shutter somewhere behind the trees. He turned sharply, flashlight sweeping the dark. Nothing. But in the morning, when he walked out to check his perimeter again, there was something new nailed to a tree at the edge of his property. A printed photograph. It showed him, standing by his cabin the day before, looking straight into the camera. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were just 3 words. "Final warning, neighbor." Ethan barely slept that night. Every sound from the woods set his nerves on edge. The creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of tires far off on the main road. He kept checking the windows, half expecting headlights to sweep through the trees again. By morning, he'd had enough. He called the county clerk's office as soon as they opened, pacing in front of the cabin with his phone pressed to his ear. After a few minutes on hold, a calm voice answered. "Property Records Division, this is Claire." "Yeah, hi," Ethan said, trying to steady his tone. "I'm calling about a boundary issue. I own a parcel just outside Cedar Ridge, but the HOA there seems to think it's theirs. What's your address?" He rattled it off. There was a pause. Then Claire said, "One moment. I'll pull that up." The silence that followed stretched on too long. When she came back, her voice carried a note of surprise. "Mr. Cole, your property isn't under Cedar Ridge jurisdiction. It's designated as exempt land, privately zoned federal easement on the south border." "Federal?" Ethan frowned. "As in government?" "Yes. There's a small security clause tied to it, usually for environmental monitoring or survey data storage. You're well outside HOA authority." He let out a low whistle. "Then why are they on my land?" Claire hesitated. "They shouldn't be. Frankly, they could be facing serious penalties if they're impersonating enforcement on federally connected land." Ethan hung up, a slow grin spreading across his face. So that was it. They'd been bluffing. By noon, the familiar silver SUV rolled back up the road, and this time Ethan was ready. Marlene stepped out again, this time flanked by 2 uniformed officers. She looked confident, even smug. "Mr. Cole," she began, "we gave you every opportunity to cooperate. Since you refused, we've filed a trespassing report. The officers will escort you off the property until the board." "Actually," Ethan interrupted, his tone calm but cutting, "you're the one trespassing." She blinked. "Excuse me?" Ethan pulled a folded paper from his back pocket and handed it to the nearest officer. "County record. Property deed updated last year. My land's privately owned and under federal easement protection." The officer scanned it, brow furrowing. "Federal?" he muttered. He turned to Marlene. "Ma'am, if that's accurate, this is outside HOA jurisdiction." "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "We have maps, old ones," Ethan cut in. "Outdated by 20 years. The HOA line ends 300 yards before my driveway. You've been harassing me, stepping onto my land, issuing fake citations. All on federally monitored property." The officer turned serious. "Ma'am, we'll need to verify this immediately. If it's correct, you'll need to leave the premises." Marlene's face went pale. "This is a misunderstanding." Ethan smiled thinly. "No, it's intimidation, and it stops today." The younger cop took a step back, hand on his radio. "Dispatch, we may have a jurisdictional conflict here. Possible federal connection. Please advise." Within minutes, another car pulled up, black sedan, tinted windows. A woman in a plain suit stepped out, flashing an ID before anyone could speak. "Agent Ramirez, Federal Land Oversight." Marlene froze. The officers straightened immediately. Ramirez walked straight to Ethan, offering a curt nod. "Mr. Cole, we've been tracking unauthorized interference near these parcels. Thank you for reporting this." Then she turned to Marlene, voice cool and official. "You've been entering restricted easement property under false authority." "That's a federal offense," Marlene stammered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know." "Maybe," Ramirez replied. "But ignorance isn't an excuse. You and your board will receive formal notice." Ethan crossed his arms, watching as the officers quietly took statements. The once powerful HOA president, the woman who'd spent days harassing him, photographing his home, and threatening order, now stood small and trembling under the weight of an actual badge. For the first time, the woods around the cabin felt quiet again. But even as the agents drove off and the patrol cars disappeared down the road, Ethan couldn't help but notice the faint tracks of SUV tires leading deeper into the pines, the same silver ones, and something about that unsettled him. Because Marlene might have been stopped, but whoever she was really working for, that part Ethan realized wasn't over yet. That night the air over Cedar Ridge was unusually still. The pine needles barely moved, and the quiet had a weight to it, like the woods themselves were waiting for something. Ethan sat by the fire pit outside his cabin, the glow from the flames catching the edge of his coffee mug. He wasn't celebrating, not yet. He'd seen too much of how people like Marlene operated, all smiles in daylight, all threats in email after dark. But this time, she had overplayed her hand. The next morning, his phone buzzed. It was Agent Ramirez. "Mr. Cole, I wanted you to hear it from me first. The Cedar Ridge HOA is under investigation. Multiple counts of property interference, misuse of municipal codes, and unauthorized contact with law enforcement." Ethan's brows lifted. "You're serious?" "Very," she replied. "We've also found out that Ms. Marlene Becker had been collecting special assessments from homeowners under a non-existent infrastructure fund. That's wire fraud. She'll be answering for that, too." He exhaled, a long, slow release of tension he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Guess karma's punctual this week," Ramirez chuckled softly. "Let's just say your little cabin drew the right kind of attention. When the story broke a few days later, it spread fast, faster than the HOA could contain it. Local papers ran headlines like, "Cedar Ridge Board President Investigated for Fraud and Federal Interference." The community forums lit up overnight. Homeowners who'd been too afraid to speak finally came forward, posting screenshots of fake fines, threatening letters, even recorded voicemails. By the weekend, Marlene had resigned for health reasons. The rest of her board scrambled to distance themselves, issuing a public apology that sounded more like damage control than remorse. Ethan didn't attend the emergency town meeting, but he didn't have to. Neighbors came to him. People who'd once looked the other way now showed up with handshakes and awkward apologies. The same ones who used to avoid eye contact when he parked his truck now asked him for advice about their property lines. Through it all, Ethan kept mostly quiet. He wasn't interested in revenge, just peace. The cabin was meant to be his retreat, not a battleground, but standing there on his porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, he couldn't help but feel a small, satisfied smile tug at his face. He'd stood his ground and won. As the wind picked up, carrying the faint hum of crickets and the smell of pine smoke, he caught a flash of movement down the road, a "for sale" sign going up in front of Marlene's house. The same SUV that once brought her to his doorstep was now parked with the trunk open, boxes being loaded. Peace, it seemed, had finally moved in. He took a sip of his coffee, looked toward the trees and muttered to himself, "Some people never learn where the line ends, until it's drawn right under their feet." Then he turned, heading inside, because for once there were no sirens, no shouting, no HOA warnings. Just quiet, just home. And as he shut the door, the screen faded to black with one final message. When someone tries to control what isn't theirs, they often end up losing what was. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life moments that end exactly how they should.